Well, President Benton, thank you for so much for probably the most generous introduction I have ever received. I know my father would have enjoyed it, and I think my mother would have believed it. And, to Dean Wilburn, thank you so much for this very unexpected invitation. And I mean that sincerely because I didn't go to Harvard. I wasn't one of Jim Wilson's students or collaborators. We met fairly late in life, and so I had sort of an Admiral Stockdale moment. Who am I? Why am I here? But then I knew that it was meant to be. I checked in. I was assigned room 207. I walked up the stairs, inserted the key, looked at the plaque, and it was, you can't make this up, the Virtue Room. So, this unexpected but welcome invitation quickly drove me back to a couple of books that I hadn't read since they appeared decades ago. And let me begin with the essays that Jim Wilson bundled together in a book called On Character, and specifically to a sentence that I know influenced me, and I strongly suspect influenced a lot of other people in this room as well. The sentence is terse and pointed. It reads in its entirety, and I quote, "In the long run, the public interest depends on private virtue." Let's think about that. Well, in the first place, this maxim challenges the adequacy of what might be called liberal institutionalism, the thesis which James Madison famously articulated in Federalist Paper number 51, that the artful arrangement of offices and incentives can adequately compensate for the deficit of virtue. Now, Wilson, as you might imagine, was fully aware of his disagreement with Madison, and he actually talks about it. He explains why he disagrees with Madison, and here was his explanation. That Madisonian institutionalism, he argued, made sense for a national government that confined its gaze to a handful of issues. But as its sphere of concern widened to include complex social issues, character came to matter more, to the point that the success of many national policies depended on it. Now, this position raises three questions. First of all, which traits of character does the public interest, as Wilson understood it, require? And here is his answer, which I will quote. "By virtue, I mean habits of moderate action, more specifically, acting with due restraint on one's impulses, due regard for the rights of others, and reasonable concern for distant consequences." Now, one might raise an objection at this point. Whether this account of virtue is adequate depends on the conception of the public interest one espouses. For example, if the public interest on occasion requires us to do things for others that they cannot demand as a matter of right, then respecting their rights will not suffice. Very much in this vein, Adam Smith stressed the civic importance of benevolence. And given Wilson's avowed intention of extending the Scottish moral sense tradition, as he says very specifically towards the beginning of his magnum opus, to which I'll turn in a minute, one might have expected Jim Wilson to follow Smith in this regard. And in this respect, I will disagree ever so politely with Brother DiIulio. In my judgment, the Scottish moral tradition was not the caboose on the Aristotelian train. It was, in fact, the engine. But more on that in just a minute. However this may be, there's a second question. How are these traits of character formed? Now, in general, Wilson says, through habituation rather than sermons in church or instruction in school. And I quote from him again, Moral virtue is the same as a good character, and a good character is formed not through moral instruction or personal self-discovery, but through the regular repetition of right actions. This is a point that he repeated frequently, usually with the same quotation from Aristotle. We become just by doing just actions, moderate by doing moderate actions, brave by doing brave acts. Third question, where are these virtues formed? And here's Jim Wilson's answer. Quote, these habits are chiefly formed in the family. And for the most part, he suggests, this is as it should be. Indeed, he terms this a division of labor. Liberal democracy needs virtue, but it is the task of non-governmental institutions, family, but in America also civil society and religion, to supply these virtues. Now note that this was not Aristotle's view, despite the fact that Aristotle is quoted almost as frequently as Adam Smith. At the end of the Ethics, Aristotle insists that it is public, politically directed education and then the law that matter most in creating the framework that first disciplines and then forms us through the repetition of morally desirable acts. The family, he says, is a distinct second best venue of moral formation, but it must step into the breach if public education is absent or public law misguided, as they mostly were, Aristotle thought. So, to summarize Wilson's view, although the public interest relies on private virtue, it is not the public sector's responsibility to produce private virtue. This is in part an empirical claim about the locus of competence, and in part a normative claim about the risks of centralized public moral instruction and its poor fit with liberal democracy as a distinctive regime. This brings me to the moral sense, Wilson's magnum opus on the topic of this conference. You don't have to read deeply to see that the book's two philosophical inspirations are Aristotle and Adam Smith. And here is how he describes the relationship between these two towering philosophers. And I quote again, like Aristotle, Smith believed that man was by nature a social animal, not only meant to live in society, but inconceivable apart from society. Smith's great contribution was to explain how society teaches us morality. There's a problem here that I think it's fair to say Wilson underplayed. And let me state it as bluntly as possible. Although Aristotle and Smith are his twin heroes and in some ways the twin pillars of the moral sense, these two thinkers disagree on fundamentals. So what are we to make of this? Let's start with the source of morality. For Smith, as we've heard all morning, morality stems from an innate sense that can express itself in a variety of ways. We are by nature inclined toward morality, Smith suggests, although we can be turned away from it. For Aristotle, virtue is neither against nature or by nature, as he says at the beginning of the Ethics. That is why man can be either the best or worst of the animals. In this respect, I think Aristotle's view of human nature and the human condition is somewhat darker than Smith's. Nor do Smith and Aristotle agree entirely on the content of morality. For example, Smith emphasizes prudence and benevolence, Aristotle, justice and magnanimity. If I had a lot more time, I would delve into this substantive disagreement, but I do not think it is trivial. Let me move on to the point that I think is most germane for the purposes of this conference, namely how morality is engendered. For Smith, our natural sympathy for others and our natural desire to enjoy their good opinion typically, though not always, direct us towards the social virtues. For Aristotle, as we've already seen, morality is the product of organized public instruction in a specific ethical view. And that is why he regarded law as so critical. One might think that this disagreement marks one of the key differences between the modern and classical conception of politics. But I believe the matter is more complicated than that. Consider Adam Smith's depiction of the market economy as, quote, a system of natural liberty. This system, he says, rests on specific traits of character, of which the most important are frugality and the ability to delay gratification. The invisible hand relies on visible virtue. But it is by no means clear that the system of natural liberty spontaneously generates the virtues that it needs. Indeed, some social theorists, Daniel Bell famously, have suggested the opposite. Well, what then? Jim Wilson was well aware of this difficulty. Indeed, he radicalized it. Here's what he says. It's really interesting. The fundamental ethical question to be asked of any economic system is whether, taken as a whole and over the long term, it will encourage or discourage good conduct. Bang. And by good conduct, he means not just the traits of character the economy needs, but also the virtues of decent social and political life. Given the events of recent years, I think it would be bold to suggest that our current economic arrangements fully measure up to Jim Wilson's demanding test. Now, we can go farther. Whatever we may want or say, public law conveys moral messages and contributes to forming patterns of conduct, for good or for ill. And our awareness of this stubborn fact shapes political debates. If we agree that avoidable dependency is bad for society as well as the soul, then we have no choice but to ask whether our social programs contribute to it, and if they do, how these programs can be reshaped to better moral effect while still doing the essential work of social support. But note that this is an empirical question, and we can't assume that we know the answer to the relationship between public law, public policy, and moral outcomes without serious empirical inquiry, a fact that I think Jim Wilson would have been the first to insist upon. But we can't stop with the virtue of self-sufficiency or the vice of dependency, as debates about social morality too often do. We agree, I hope, that the habit of doing one's fair share to discharge civic responsibilities is another important virtue. In this context, consider the decision we made 4 decades ago to replace the military draft with an all-volunteer force. There are many sensible arguments to be made about the superior effectiveness of an all-volunteer force, but it's hard to deny its moral message. That is, that national defense is a career option and not a civic responsibility. And I think Jim Wilson would have thought, that we should argue about whether we should be comfortable with the consequences of this message. Is it good for the country that only a small fraction of the population ever does military service? Or that fewer than 1/5 of the current members of Congress have done so? Or that the overseas combat of recent decades has become more spectator sport than shared civic undertaking? Considerations of this sort, I believe, led Jim Wilson to qualify his division of labor thesis and endorse, at least in principle, a role for government in character formation. But as a skeptical empiricist, and we've heard a lot about his skeptical empiricism this morning, he added a cautionary note, which I will read. Quote, "It is easier to acknowledge the necessary involvement of government in character formation than it is to prescribe how this responsibility should be carried out." The essential first step is to acknowledge that at root, in almost every important area of public concern, we are seeking to induce people to act virtuously, close quote. Now, note the careful wording. Wilson says induce, not teach, not persuade. Law can seek to do this through commands and prohibitions, of course, but Wilson saw more potential in the use of incentives, which is why he came to talk of economics as being in the service of virtue. There is no conflict between economic thought and moral philosophy, he declared. The latter simply supplies a fuller statement of the uses to which the former can and should be put. A truly arresting proposition. He even managed to link the moral uses of economics to his Aristotelian account of character formation. Economists understand how incentives shape behavior, he argued, but they overlook how repeated behavior shapes the internal patterns we call virtue. What economics neglects, he argues, is the important subjective consequence of acting in accord with a proper array of incentives. People come to feel pleasure in right action and guilt in wrong action. And these sentiments lie at the core of good character. Using self-interest to change behavior is one thing. Seeing the relationship between behavioral change and character formation, quite another. So, economics can be deployed in the service of Aristotle's conception of virtue. Now, but why is it so important to move from incentives to character formation as the basis of behavior? And here are some reasons that one can glean from a reading of The Moral Sense. In the first place, carrots and sticks are costly, especially if they serve as the principal source of compliance. Suppose, for example, that a well-founded fear of being audited was all that restrained most of us from cheating on our income taxes. If so, the IRS would have to invest in audit capacities many times larger than its current limited operations would allow. This brings me to the second point, and that is a sole reliance on incentives means that government's scope would have to expand. Granted, regulatory command and control strategies may be even worse, but far better to use law to create patterns of behavior that become self-sustaining without requiring an ongoing, costly, intrusive stream of external rewards, threats, and punishments. And finally, as economists have taught us, government enforcement strategies labor under a structural disadvantage, namely information asymmetry. Individual citizens know more about their own conduct than do public officials, and they have strong incentives to hide what they do not want those officials to discover. The intrusive surveillance needed to rectify this imbalance of information is unpopular always and everywhere. And it is especially hard to justify and sustain in liberal democracies, where norms of individual liberty and personal privacy tend to be strong, and where aggrieved citizens can put pressure on public officials to cease and desist. For example, the remarkable rise in public support for decriminalizing marijuana does not rest on pervasive changes in public attitudes about the prudence and propriety of marijuana use. Rather, it reflects two other shifts. Number one, an increase in libertarian attitudes. And two, and even more, a public judgment that the costs of enforcing current marijuana restrictions outweigh the benefits. By the way, a very similar judgment brought about the end of prohibition. in 1933. Now, I've argued that using law to shape character is morally preferable to the deployment of incentives to change behavior, and it offers distinct practical advantages as well, within limits. What are those limits? In the first place, the requisite agreement on the content of good character may not exist. And if so, government efforts to shape civic character are bound to be intensely controversial. And before we get carried away with the belief that there is pervasive social agreement on the content of civically relevant virtue, we should pay some attention to reams of public opinion data suggesting that ideological differences generate different conceptions of the virtues that ought to be encouraged through public policy and public law. Liberals and conservatives unite in their admiration for certain virtues, such as courage in the face of physical danger, but they diverge on many others. Second, and even more fundamentally, if you consider the phrase liberal democracy, the adjective in that phrase is the antonym not of conservative, but rather of total. The adjective denotes a form of government whose legitimate scope is limited. And there is a risk that the process of character formation will cross the line and intrude on the sphere appropriately reserved to individuals, families, and voluntary associations, secular as well as religious. Clashes over textbooks, curricula, and pedagogy in public schools often revolve around this issue, and they can stop civic education dead in its tracks. And there's a further complication. And I've tried to think this through over a period of decades without notable success. The complication is this. There is a difference between human virtue and civic virtue. The human virtues are universal in the sense that they define human goodness or excellence everywhere and for all time. By contrast, the civic virtues are located in time and in space relative to specific regime types. For example, Mr. Carson, the butler in Downton Abbey, is morally impressive, very impressive man, but his virtues are rooted in and are of aristocracy and not liberal democracy. They're the virtues of hierarchy and of deference. There is no guarantee that non-public institutions such as families and civil society groups will impart the virtues that liberal democracy needs. Some may do the opposite. I read the theory of moral sentiments as an account of how social relations help develop what Adam Smith presents as human virtues. Whether they will develop regime-specific civic virtues is another matter altogether. Now, an optimistic sociology would suggest that families and civil society will inevitably take on the character of the regime within which they operate. The regime permeates even where it does not command. In a liberal democracy, it would follow, relations within families will reflect principles of liberty and equality. Religious organizations are more likely to be congregational than hierarchical, and so forth. Maybe so, and Tocqueville, I believe, thought so. But history offers many counterexamples, and it's hard to feel confident that character formation can be left entirely outside the public sphere, even in America. And that, I guess, is why I've spent so much time writing essays about the liberal virtues and doing research on school-based civic education. But let me end these remarks on a skeptical note about Jim Wilson's position and also about my own. In his essay, The Rediscovery of Character, Wilson argues that the rising crime rate of the 1970s, which, as we now know, continued for another decade, could not be explained simply by the shifting cost-benefit calculations of would-be offenders. Crime has cultural determinants as well, he argued. In our case, the replacement of an ethic of self-control with an ethic of self-expression, which works out much better for highly educated, upscale young people who can afford some early mistakes than for those with fewer resources and lower social status. But even if crime does have a cultural component, it does not follow that it has a cultural remedy. Over the past 2 decades, the rate of violent crime has fallen dramatically, farther and faster than anyone thought it would as late as the early 1990s. It is hard to argue with evidence that benign cultural changes are responsible for this drop. And we might regard newly elected New York City Mayor Bill de Blasio's abandonment of stop and frisk as a laboratory test of this proposition. Instead of betting on cultural transformation, we took, as people in this room know, and as many people in this room have studied, we took deliberate measures to change the calculus of potential criminals, changes in policing, sentencing, and incarceration, among others. And these measures worked, not because they produced widespread moral improvement, but rather because they shifted individual incentives and forcibly restrained those whose misbehavior could not be deterred. Although I would like to believe otherwise, and have spent much of my scholarly and professional career believing otherwise, perhaps that is the best that liberal democracy, or in any event, our liberal democracy, can do right now. Individual character is never irrelevant. Wilson is right about that. But it may be more resistant to publicly induced changes than he often supposed and that I once did. Thank you very much.